And with us now is the Commissioner of Economic and Community Development, Dan O'Keefe. Commissioner O'Keefe, good to see you back here in the program.
Good to see you. Thank you for having me.
So I know, like, during the State of the State address, the governor said that we have to figure out how to navigate during the Trump era. What has it been like so far in the first week or so?
So far, it's been pretty chaotic, if I'm being honest. You know, one thing we learned from the first Trump administration is he views unpredictability as a feature, not a bug. So we can't expect there to be a high degree of predictability. But just today, for example, last night, we all woke up this morning to an executive order saying all federal funding was being shut down. That has since been put on pause by a federal judge literally an hour ago, but that gives you a sense for the kind of unpredictability we're dealing with as an administration. But what the governor said is right. It is our duty on behalf of the people of Connecticut to find a way to work with this administration to make sure we optimize however best we can for the state of Connecticut.
And we've done some reporting on the impact of social services because of this pause in funding, but how has it impacted economic development, your department?
Well, so Controller Scanlon said today that federal funding in the last fiscal year represented about $14 billion in total funding. So that's funding that goes towards many programs, including ones that are managed by the DECD, Economic Development Programs. It's a significant amount of money.
How could tariffs impact Connecticut?
So again, we're still waiting to see where tariffs might be imposed. So what matters for the state of Connecticut is we have certain large industries which, if tariffs are imposed on supply chains in regions where those supply chains are functioning, then the costs for those companies will obviously increase. So one of the things we've done is we've recently announced a program, a $25 million program called Strategic Supply Chains, where if you are in one of those supply chains, so it needs to make sense for the state of Connecticut. It needs to be a company that is supplying a strategic industry for us, and you're in a region where you're potentially exposed to some of these tariffs, we'll help with incentives to move some of that production capacity onto our shores into the state of Connecticut.
And how will this create jobs in your estimation?
So production capacity is a simple way of saying jobs. So if you're investing in the infrastructure, in the plant to build whatever these widgets are, you need people to do it. So it's directly related to job creation.
Let's talk a little bit about the defense industry, which of course is a big factor in our economy here in our state. And the president has said that he wants to make the military the biggest and best ever. Any word as to what kind of impact we might get from that here in our state? I mean,
not yet, but you are right. You know, we have a pretty large manufacturing industry in the state of Connecticut. It's a little over 12% of our economy. If you look at the New England region, that's a much higher percentage than any other state in the region. And you ask yourself why that is. It's because, as you mentioned, we have a very large national defense business here. That's a legacy that goes back 100 years. We've built a very specialized workforce to be able to produce these incredibly complicated machines. That's the good news. We view that as a relatively protected industry, and in fact our hope is many of these areas where these supply chains might be impacted, these might be relevant for those same companies.
I want to talk about housing for a little bit because the governor mentioned that in his State of the State address as well, and we've seen a lot of new housing being built, particularly apartments in the cities, Stamford, Hartford, a whole bunch of them in and around Duncan Park and downtown, a lot of conversions in New Haven as well. Where do you see this going in 2025? What kind of new projects?
Yeah, I mean, look, the good news is that our population's been increasing. So if you look at the trends post-pandemic, pre-pandemic, our population was decreasing. Post-pandemic, it wasn't just a pandemic blip. Every year since the pandemic, our population has increased. That's the good news. Bad news is you got to find places to put folks. And by the way, you got to find it at a moment in time where we start to see inflation and the cost of that housing increase. The governor has announced a multi-year commitment to housing, $800 million. That's almost 3x. What we've invested in housing historically, and that's started to be very effective. So if you look at net housing starts, that number had been flat for about 15 years. It was positive, meaning we were adding to our housing stock, but it wasn't growing. In the last 2 years, that number's up almost 50%. And I think that's for two reasons. The first is I mentioned the support that this administration is doing for housing, but I think more importantly, it's because builders, developers are getting more optimistic about the state of Connecticut. They're seeing the exact same trends I am and saying this is actually a good time to start taking a bet on building housing stock for Connecticut.
And what kind of small businesses do you think we'll see growing out of these apartment clusters, so to speak? Because in Hartford, we've seen a lot of new restaurants, things like that.
Yeah, so if you look at new business starts, so my role is both Commissioner of Economic Development, but also Chief Innovation Officer for the state. So I spend a lot of time thinking about and working with the ecosystem supporting our small businesses, including our startups. And if you look at new startup growth year on year, we grew faster than any other state in the region. And by the way, faster than places like Florida and Georgia, places that people looked at and said, well, isn't everybody moving and starting down in these sort of southern states post-pandemic? Those states did benefit, but it was a blip. It was a short-term benefit, whereas the trends that we've seen here in Connecticut have sustained.
You know, years ago, the governor said, I think he used Delray Beach as an example, said he wanted to keep people in Connecticut rather than moving to Florida. And we've seen a little bit of that. And there seems to be a lot of negative stories about Florida recently, too, in terms of like condo fees going up because of all the climate change and the weather situations. Are you seeing people kind of slowing down or maybe putting a pause on leaving Connecticut for warmer climes?
We are. So if you look at overall population trends, our total population is going up, but if you break it down domestically, meaning that the number we benefit from people moving to our state from another state versus those that are leaving, that's been negative. We tend to basically lose more people to the south than we gain from places like New York and Massachusetts. The reason for that is we have an aging population. But the good news is we make up for that in international in-migration. That's why our total population goes up. If I look at the last couple of years, we're starting to see those trends around domestic out-migration start to slow. And I think it's the exact dynamic you describe, is people are starting to realize, okay, quality of education is not as high as I thought it was going to be. Certainly it's not as high as what we have here in Connecticut. The quality of healthcare is not as high. The quality of life is not as high. And oh, by the way, expenses are going up because of all the factors you mentioned. So yes, we are starting to see that start to reverse. In fact, there was a Wall Street Journal article about that very fact.
All right, what can we get a sneak peek into what you know about the governor's budget address coming up? What can you tell us?
Look, I'll tell you
without revealing anything.
I'm not going to reveal anything. I'll save that for the boss. But I will tell you, look, we are in a tight cycle right now. I think that is well understood. The fiscal guardrails are going to be a topic of strong debate. I can tell you, as someone focused on the Connecticut economy, am very focused on retaining the fiscal guardrails. We cannot go back to where we were, which was described then as a permanent state of fiscal crisis. That was accurate. What we now have is an environment of consistent surpluses and predictability and stability. We are managing the state's finances like you and I should be managing our household, how we expect anyone to manage a business. It's the right thing to do, and I think it's going to be a more challenging debate around the budget this year, but we'll get to the right place.
The Commissioner of Economic and Community Development, Dan O'Keefe. Always great to have you on the program. We'll see you again this year.
Thanks again.
Next, we're talking about the restaurant business when This Week in Connecticut returns on this Sunday morning.